Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by Go Collect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, as well as the new host of the Go Collect weekly speculation video. As a comic book collector and as a YouTuber, I am pumped to be doing these weekly videos on behalf of Go Collect. And in just a couple of moments, we are going to dig into 6 blog posts that have been posted to the Go Collect website over the last few days. But before we get there, I want to do some level setting. And I think that this is very important level setting for us as collectors. When I talk about these blog posts in just a couple of moments, and certainly in subsequent weeks, I'm going to be touching on some of the high points from these blog posts. I am not going to be going into all of the nuanced detail that one might need to make some informed decisions about how you want to spend your money. So I would definitely encourage you to click on the links in the description of this video, take some time to read these blog posts in their entirety before you pull the trigger on any kind of advice from these blog posts or from anything that I might say. I'm also a huge fan of taking some time to do some research. Make sure that you are making an informed decision before you start to spend your own money. So just a couple of cautionary notes right there. I think that these blog posts are pretty solid. I've read them a few times and there is some pretty awesome stuff here that I can't wait to share with you, but I had to make sure that I put that cautionary note out there for you guys as well. So what I'll be doing, as I kind of mentioned, I'm going to be reviewing weekly roughly 5 to 7 different blog posts that have been submitted by bloggers into Go Collect. And so what I'll be doing is touching on some of the high points. I'll be reading excerpts from these blog posts as well as offering some commentary of my own. Without any further ado, let's jump into the first article. So this very first blog post is from Norman, and the title of this article is "The Future of Comic Book Conventions, A New Hope." And I want to read an excerpt from this thing because Norman uses some fiery language here, and I want to share this with you guys. It says, "All of the major conventions are at first a marvelous immersion into pop culture. Then reality hits home as a fan, and you go from one con to the next, all with the sinking feeling that there are fewer and fewer comic books at each convention you visit. Then it hits home. These supposed comic book cons are a big con. They end up becoming nothing more than an assault on your senses and your wallet. Where are the comic book vendors? Yup. They're buried in the back corner. Usually only the biggest dealers will show up, as it is too expensive for the smaller comic book dealers to set up a table profitably. You just spent $60 to get into the con for one day, and the vendor prices are above even regularly high retail prices at your LCS. Norman uses some fiery language. I mean, he goes on to basically talk about how the cons aren't really set up for comic book collectors, you know, and if you've been to some of the major cons that are out there, you know exactly what Norman is talking about. I don't know if I would call it a con per se, but what I will say is that I think that these conventions have become much, much bigger than just a comic book show, right? There is all of the cosplay, there's the artist alley, there are the really famous artists as well as actors that show up to do signatures and photo ops and things like that. There are the people that set up to display their swords and their crafts and other accoutrements, but there aren't always a whole lot of comic book vendors at these venues. And I've been to, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 cons over this last year, and I can attest to what Norman is talking about here in this article. And he goes on to talk about that there is a new hope. There is a hope, new hope on the horizon for all comic book speculation Jedi. And he goes on to talk about how there are, I guess, a surge, if you will, of cons that are popping up that are true comic book cons, where you go and there is literally nothing but comic books. And Norman actually goes on to share a story about how he went to one of these small cons, how he was greeted by the owner of the con, who greeted him at the door, took his money, and engaged him in a pleasant conversation. He goes on to talk about how just it was such a different experience in that everyone was talking about comic books, and it was just a lot of fun and camaraderie. And I can attest to this. I can tell you for a fact that I have been to a lot of these smaller cons that are really just geared towards comics, and I have so much more fun than the very large cons. Now, the thing is I don't know if this is a new hope. I mean, maybe it is a new hope, but what I would say is I think that this is a resurgence and potentially a return to what used to happen back in the day. And I've been in and out of comics, over the last, 20 some odd years, right? I think this most recent time is my longest stint. But back in the day, it was pretty commonplace for there to be these small comic book meetings, these small comic book exchanges at hotels and small ballrooms in people's backyards, even, where just comic book collectors came together and did little swaps and actually did some dealing. And I think that maybe there is a resurgence of those kinds of activities. And I honestly think that it is fantastic. Like Norman, I have experienced firsthand that at these smaller cons, people are willing to wheel and deal because they don't have to pay crazy prices in order to get a booth set up. And so the dealers are more likely to actually do some deals where they are actually at, if not well below, FMV. And so I think that this, again, is a wonderful article that kind of highlights the fact that the big cons may not be where we want to go, especially if we are comic book collectors, especially if we are trying to speculate on some books, which means that we might need to buy them a little cheaper so that we can do some things to turn around and ultimately sell those books. So again, if you're interested in learning more about Norman's experience and some of the deals that he was able to pick up at his con, I definitely want to encourage you to check out this blog post, link in the description. So this next blog post is from a blogger by the name of James, and it's entitled Uptick in Some Lower Tier Daredevil Antagonists. And this is actually a pretty cool article, and I think that it's cool for several reasons. So oftentimes speculation is about buying and not necessarily about selling. But what James actually talks about in this particular article is he talks about 3 books that in the past were pretty high, that have dipped down, but in recent years have started to kind of creep up. And he kind of asked the question of, is now the time to actually sell these books? And so I thought that that was kind of a unique thing versus just saying, buy it now, the price is right. He's basically saying, hey, the price is good. And if you have these books, you might want to sell them right now because they might be at an all-time high. And so in this article, he actually talks about 3 different Daredevil books, all of which contain first appearances. And the very first book is Daredevil number 8 from 1965. And this is actually the first appearance of the Stilt Man. And the cover is one that is just iconic to me. I've seen it repeatedly. I do not own the book, but I think that the cover is a really cool one. But James kind of points out here that sales prices for the last year and a half for Daredevil number 8 have not just started a move upward, but have already surpassed the 2014 level. And so again, it was high in 2014, it dipped down, and now it's starting to creep up. He says that a CGC 8.5 slab has even set a new record with a $355 sales price, basically placing it higher than the 2013 peak. So again, solid book. There's a lot of sales volume, at least what it appears to be from the chart that James included here. And so the question becomes, if you have this book, is now the time to sell? He goes on to talk about Daredevil number 10, which is actually the first appearance of 3 characters, that being Deborah Harris, the Ant-Man, and also the Organizer. And in this particular article, I think he kind of cited that the volume for that particular book, that being Daredevil number 10, is a little lower. But again, the book seems to be performing. It says, below are the sales data for Daredevil number 10, also in the grades of CGC 9.8 to 8.0. And so again, might be another book that that folks want to kind of look at. Same with this next book, that being Daredevil number 12. And this is actually the first appearance of the Plunderer. And so again, he kind of points out some of the data here. He says the sales volume is very, very low, but one quick look, we observed a similar market behavior. Again, similar market behavior on what we're talking about in terms of the prices being high, them kind of dropping off, and now they're starting to kind of creep up. And he says the one difference is that the grades observed here for Daredevil number 12 had its highest peak in 2012. And so again, just a couple of data points here. Again, you probably want to go definitely read this article in its entirety to look at the volumes and the grades that he is talking about and how these books kind of perform. He says for a long-term strategy, it could be a good idea to reduce your holdings of any of the aforementioned comics. So again, pretty cool article here focusing on some lower tier Daredevil related antagonists. So check it out, link in the description. So this next article from Norman, it's a fascinating one. It is a fascinating one. And if you are like a fan of Kiss, you may already know about this, but if you are not, you want to listen to this because this is different. So this is it's entitled Comic Book Novelty Kiss of Blood, and you'll hear why that's interesting in just a moment. Truly unique comic books are hard to come by. Often, a new story or superhero has been created many times before, but occasionally, a comic book is created that speaks to a generation. Perhaps that generation is yearning for something new, something like a heavy metal comic book. Gene Simmons and the marketing team at Kiss were ahead of the curve with this novelty item. So the long and short of it is that there was a comic book that was released by Marvel, and it was called Marvel Comics Super Special Number 1. And the script was actually done by Steve Gerber, and there was a team comprised of Alan Weiss, John Buscema, Sal Buscema, and also Rich Buckler that were all involved with this project. The long and short of it is that the guys at Kiss wanted to do something different. So they literally had, according to this blog post, a notary witness their blood being drawn. They then went to where Marvel's production facility was. They poured their blood into the ink, mixed it in, and then had the comic book printed. And this was, again, Marvel Comics Super Special Number 1, in-store date of December 1st, 1976. I had heard rumors of a comic book that was mixed with blood. I honestly had no clue what it was. Now I know. It was the guys at Kiss and my man Gene Simmons, no relation to me, Regie Simmons. But what's crazy, or what's interesting, I should say, is that there's actually some interesting sales data with this particular book. A 9.8 actually sold for over $1,000. A 9.2 sold for $167, and 8.5, $315. I wonder if that one was signed or something. That's an interesting price. And then the 5.0 actually sold for $69. So very, very interesting article. Norman actually goes into a little bit of detail and into the background of Kiss and how they were formed and how they were, they spoke to a generation. So if you are a Kiss fan, if you're into novel, different types of comic books, you definitely want to check out this blog post. Again, link in the description. So clearly Norman is on a roll because he also just wrote this blog post as well. And it's called A Strange attraction. And I'm not going to read his intro, but I definitely would encourage you to click on the link in the description of this video. Check out his intro. As a writer, I really appreciate how Norman kind of gets into an article, gets into a story, and he has a little bit of fun in this intro. So I would definitely encourage you to check it out. But in this blog post, he actually spends some time talking about some MCU speculation. There is a lot of rumor out there right now, and I don't know if any of it's confirmed. It might all be unconfirmed rumor at this point, that Doctor Strange's girlfriend Clea is going to make an appearance in the upcoming Doctor Strange movie. And so as a result of that, Norman took some time to actually look at the performance of her first appearance, specifically Strange Tales number 126, again, her first appearance. And he goes on in this article to basically talk about how Clea was actually created by Stan Lee and Stephen Ditko. Stephen Ditko, actually, they worked together on the script. And Jack Kirby and Dick Ayers and Stephen Ditko also worked on the art. I guess this was all around 1964. And it says the online rumor mill is generating information about Clea. Apparently, she will be in the next movie, the next Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And so in this particular blog post, Norman actually spends some time digging into some of the sales performance for this particular comic. And he kind of talks about how the sales prices are kind of meandering, a little bit good, a little bit bad, depending upon whether you're doing it for the long term or for the short term. And he points out here that the short term returns are actually stronger than the long-term trends by far. And so he's almost recommending here that, this might not be a good long-term play, or at least historically has not been a good long-term play, but in the short term, it may actually be kind of rebounding. And I think he's making the point here that if Clea actually does appear in an upcoming MCU movie, it could have a dramatic impact on this particular book, specifically her first appearance. And so he doesn't necessarily say go out and buy it, but he definitely says this might be one that you want to keep your eye on, especially if you are a Doctor Strange fan or a Clea fan. This might be one book that you want to add to your collection. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, you definitely want to spend some time digging into this article because there is some nuance here that you should be aware of and be familiar with. And then also take some time to do a little bit of research on your own. So we are in the month of February, and you know what that means. It is Black History Month. And so Ariel, a guy that I actually know pretty well because he's a subscriber of my YouTube channel, he actually wrote a pretty cool article in the Go Collect blog page where he actually talks about some pretty awesome books that are associated with African Americans. And so a lot of these books that he kind of highlights in this particular article have some historical significance. And I am pleased to say that I own at least one of the books that is on his list. There are a couple of others that I would love to pick up if the price and the timing are right. So let's take a look at the article here. He talks a little bit about during the celebration of Amazing Innovators, people forget that comics shared some of the same outside views seen during those troubled times. President Gerald R. Ford stated, Americans need to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. And in this article, Ariel actually highlights 10 different comics that actually have some historical significance. And I'm not going to dig into all 10 of them, but I do want to touch on just a couple of them. The first one that he mentions is Jumbo Comics number 69 from 1944. And he says here, this is the first published interior art in the comic field by the first known Black artist known as Matt Baker. He says Matt was also credited for illustrating the first graphic novel. And he highlights here that there are only 8 of these particular books, that being Jumbo Comics 69, only 8 of them on the CGC census. He says one graded at a 6.5 via CBCS sold for $550 and $28 in 2018. He says, due to age alone, this book will hold its value, but you cannot beat the history around it. He talks a little bit about another book here, that being Jungle Tales #1. And I actually became aware of this book last year when an Instagrammer actually put up some commentary about this particular book. And what I found interesting about this book is that it seems to me that it might be a prototype for Black Panther. And it's a prince in South Africa, no powers, but he is skilled in hand-to-hand combat and fights with a spear. And I don't know, to me, it had a little bit of a Black Panther feel to it. And he points out, Ariel does, that this is another rare find. With only 8 in the census, it's weird that its FMV isn't higher. Again, he's making the point here that with 8 in the census, he feels that the FMV for this particular book should actually be higher. He points out that a CBCS Blue Label actually sold in August of 2019 at a 3.5 for only $120. There's another one in here, another book he highlights from 1957. It's Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And then maybe my favorite on the list, because I own it, is Lobo #1 from 1965. This is the first comic book title to feature a Black character published by Dale Comics. And this is a really cool book. I enjoyed it. It was a Western. I'm not a huge fan of Westerns, but I picked the book up. I've read issue #1 and issue #2, and I can tell you the art is solid, the lettering is solid, the colors are solid, and the story actually isn't bad. But this is a really cool book. If you can find Lobo 1 and 2, I would encourage you to pick it up, because I personally think that it's a cool book and actually has some historical significance attached to it, which I think is always a plus. Ariel goes on to talk about Fantastic Four #52, which is the first appearance of the Black Panther from 1966. And I personally feel like this book has cooled off just a little. I felt like a couple of years ago, the book was really hot. You know, when the Black Panther movie was being made and all that kind of stuff. I feel like it's cooled off a little bit recently, and I may actually pick up a copy. I had this on my want list in 2018 into 2019. I didn't buy it because it was hot. And so now might be the time, because here Ariel is actually talking about a 5.0 for CGC, I guess sold for $525, and that seems pretty low compared to what that book used to look like in the past. He goes on to talk about Teen Titans #26 from 1970, Green Lantern from 1976. So again, really cool books that mark some historical significance in time. If you're into these kind of books, I would definitely encourage you to check out the blog post, link in the description, read all of the details, do a little bit of research, and then decide what's in your best interest to do. So the very last blog post that I'm actually going to talk about, at least in this episode of the Go Collect recap video, is an article on Miles Morales. And this blogger goes on to kind of talk about how Miles Morales is just a super hot character that has a long future in Marvel and in the MCU. And so they actually highlight several different comics that you might want to check out. And honestly, a lot of them were really the variants and the ratio variants, to be more specific, versus just the regular comics. And so very interesting point here, but I want to touch on a couple of these, and I think at least one or two of them are like the usual suspects when we talk about Miles Morales. The first one being Ultimate Fallout #4. The blogger talks specifically about the 1 in 25 variant being the one that is most sought after, and it also sells for a pretty hefty price of around $2,000 to $3,000 for a 9.8. The blogger points out that they personally like the second print where Miles Morales' face is actually exposed. They talk about the fact that that particular print run was less than 15,000 copies, and they feel that people are actually sleeping on it, kind of sort of because there's only 300 or so graded copies on the CGC census. So and that's kind of compared to the other cover, the first print, with roughly 4,300 copies on the CGC census. So maybe there's something there. You may want to look into it. Another book that they highlight about Miles Morales is the Ultimate Comics All New Spider-Man #1. This book features Miles' second appearance and is the first time he shows up in his own title. The writer specifically talks about several of the variants from Sarah Pacelli, specifically the Unmasked 1 in 15 variant, her 1 in 30 variant as the ones that people might want to look at actually picking up. The next article or the next book that they talk about is Miles Morales, Ultimate Spider-Man #1. This is Miles Morales' second solo title and the first time his name actually appears in the title. They say that this book had a small print run of less than 50,000 copies, making the variant covers very hard to find. And they actually point out that maybe the one people should look at is the one from David Peterson. It is a 1 in 25 variant that, according to them, rarely shows its head anywhere. There are a total of 43 listed on the CGC census, so they are making the recommendation that you actually pick one up. There's also a 1 in 50 variant that folks may want to look at with a total print run, again, of less than 50,000. And very few retailers, they say, were ordering 50 copies of this book in order to be able to get the variant, which again is why they are kind of focusing on the variants. The very last book that they actually recommend people take a look at is Marvel Premiere #95. And the idea is that this book actually includes the first true appearance of Miles Morales and predates his appearance in Ultimate Fallout by a full 3 months. Now, I kind of sort of disagree with the blogger on this one. They talk about that there are a total of 2 graded copies on the CGC census, therefore making it the rarest book on the list, and the book doesn't even show up when you search for it on Go Collect. While these sorts of books aren't for everyone, they are a definite for me as they are super unique. As a result, this book has the potential to skyrocket in price given its scarcity. And that last point is one that I sort of disagree with, in the sense that preview magazines, I don't know if they have the potential to skyrocket, right? Because most people like to get the first appearance of a character in continuity, and preview magazines aren't necessarily in continuity. Now, what they did say is that it's not for everyone, but for them, it is actually something that they would look at picking up. And I think that that is an important nuance to make, right? There is a difference between a previews magazine and a first appearance of a character in continuity. And I can speak from experience that I have many of the first appearances of Spider-Man in his black costume in various journals, like the Comic Journal. But the book that people go after are like Amazing Spider-Man 252. Or Secret Wars #8. Those are the kind of books that people go after because it is in continuity in the main title. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this weekly recap. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, I want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button, leave a comment behind, and let us know what you think. Take care.